May all beings be happy, may all beings be healthy, may all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life, may all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his, and anything else that comes to mind. Today we've got a special guest, Andy Ferguson, author of Zen's Chinese Heritage and Tracking Bodhidharma. Two great books. Zen's Chinese Heritage, the original wisdom version, had a lineage chart in it that was big. You could take it out and unfold it, and it was all over Zen Center, and it traced the lineage, the Zen lineages back, and I wonder where that is now. Maybe we're going to get Andy back. This is pretty good, and we're going to get him back to talk more about these various Buddhist and Chinese subjects and so forth. And I'll ask him about that lineage chart where we can see it. Maybe we could put it on Cuke.com. He also did China tours, quite a few China tours. He brought Zen groups to China. And anyway, we talk about that. One thing you'll notice is a lot of sound in the background, and that is rain. Now I could have closed the window and turned on the air conditioner, which I have to do if I get locked in here. But I like the sound of rain. It's funny because it's not that much different from the sound of the fan, but I take the sound of the fan out, and I only leave it on the first setting. This fan here is a little fast. It's funny. We've got fans all over the place. We've got, this is a ceiling fan. We've got, 15, 16 fans, ceiling, wall, stand-up, and the type of ceiling fan in the restroom, that sucks the air up. I think at least 15 to 17 fans, because we like fans more than air conditioning. Anyway, so I run a little noise reduction to take the fan out because it's pretty low. But then I was noticing, wow, listen to that noise. Is that the fan? And then I realized, oh, no, that's the rain. And right away I went, oh, that's cool. So anyway, so you'll hear rain, and it really builds up at one point. This has been a really, really rainy season here in Bali and in Australia. And Bali weather is a little related to Australia weather. Australian storms will affect Bali too sometimes, and they've had tremendous flooding. But we're not having that. It does flood here some, but not where we live. I mean, our courtyard will flood. The back courtyard will flood. We have these sort of like cigar-shaped sandbags that we designed and made. That Nyoman, our trusty driver assistant, went to a tailor and had these bags made, and he went down to the beach and filled them with sand. The one in the back we've had to use a few times. It's amazing how long it has to rain to get that water to where it can come in the back door. Incidentally, it's not a big deal. The floors are tile, and even when it did come in, very, very little would come in because it drains pretty quick. But I've been having quite a bit of rain. It's getting pretty late in the rainy season, and it's been raining quite a bit. But, when it rains here, it's rare for it to be solid rain all day. You can go to the beach or get out and walk just about any day in the rainy season. All right. So we're going to, I wanted to mention one other thing. Andy tells me that our dear friend, Jeffrey Hayden has passed on. Now, Jeffrey and Andy grew up together in Oregon, and you'll hear me commenting on what a character he was. But I don't say what he did. I just want to say a couple things. Because I could have taken that out, but I left it in honor of Jeffrey. Jeffrey was an Asian art dealer, and he had dealings with Richard Baker, Zen Center, people I know. And Andy said he was, Andy had great respect for his knowledge of Asian art and what was high quality, what was low quality, what was real, what wasn't. And Jeffrey was also a dowser. He would douse professionally for water in Sonoma and Marin counties, maybe Lake County. And Andy said he doused Asian art. I said, what do you mean he doused Asian art? He said, I was with him with some Asian art specialists, and they would put, pieces in front of him, and, he'd put his hand over them or something, and then say whether they were authentic or not. And he said, they said he was right every time. Anyway, that's pretty amazing. I'll try to remember to ask Andy about that next time. Another thing Jeffrey was a big guy. He was a tough guy, very tough. And he liked to offend people. And he was a hunter, my son Clay and I used to go to his place. And then he'd say, hey, you want to shoot a gun, Clay? And then he'd get Clay out shooting some, shotgun or rifle and stuff. And, he'd have a boar hanging up skinned, and we'd go for walks. And he was a heavy equipment operator, and he collected old Mercedes, and he had like a giant vault. He had like 55 acres in Hopland. Anyway, this podcast is not about Jeffrey. Just wanted to give you all right. Well, one thing. Very few will remember that at one point Green Gulch Farm had a sawmill. Paul Disco will remember it. Jeffrey brought it there, operated it, had something to do with him. And then Tomoe-san came after her husband, Dining Katagiri, had died. And I don't know, she had something to do. I mean, sweet little delicate Tomoe-san, senior citizen, a Japanese woman. She had something to do with driving the whole thing back in a giant truck to Minnesota for that group there. Anyway, I remember Jeffrey coming to Green Gulch to work on it or something. He had heavy equipment on his place in Hopland. And he was a marijuana grower and never got in trouble. He was always within the law, but he was right at the top of that when it started. And what a character. Anyway, it's enough on Jeffrey. And so, look, we're going to give Andy a call just as soon as we've had our pause to meditate. So when you hear the bell, hit pause if you're of such a mind, and meditate or whatever for as long as you want. And when you're ready to come back, hit unpause. And we'll be there to hit the bell to end the meditation and give Andy Ferguson a call.
Hello.
Andy.
Yeah, hi, David.
How you doing?
Pretty well.
Good. Gee, Andy, we haven't talked in a long time. It's good to hear your voice.
Yeah. Have you been in Bali all this time?
Yep. What have you been up to?
Well, I was living in Paris for a while,
No
And then,
kidding.
yeah, my daughter married a French guy, and so I have French in-laws.
Oh, how
And
was that? How was that?
it's pretty nice. I've learned to speak French, and I enjoyed living in Paris. But we're back in Petaluma now. They're moving back to the United States.
Hmm.
Uh, they went to school together in Columbia, and then they lived in Washington D.C. for a few years.
Uh.
Then they went. Then they went to France, and now they're going to come back and live in the Bay Area.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Wow.
it's a new dimension on my life that I've enjoyed.
Yeah, that's cool. Wow. Hmm. And French. So, how many languages do you speak?
Well, the only ones that I could say that I can carry on a conversation well is Chinese, French, and English.
Oh,
I've I've
good.
I've,
Wow.
I've studied Japanese, but I'm not fluent in it. I can read it pretty well, but I can't speak it very well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and I studied Spanish, and
Yeah.
screwed around with that, but I'm pretty much into speaking French these days, or reading French. I'm reading French novels right now.
No kidding. That is amazing. And how long ago did you start doing that?
Uh, well, I mean, actually, reading French novels, I just started a couple of years ago, but I've been doing French for about 5 years.
Uh-huh. Well, that's good, man. That's good. You're a good language student. So, anything happening on the Buddhist front?
Uh, well, it's complicated. I've been I've done a lot of historical research in the past several years about. Well, let me back up a little bit, give you a bigger picture.
Yeah.
Uh, so to me, there's, I mean, frankly, your book, Crooked Cucumber, and other books I read helped me tumble to the fact that there are historical circumstances that give rise to everything, and including Buddhism
Mm-hmm.
and types of Buddhism, and how people practice Buddhism and so on. So I was influenced by a few American scholars I read years ago that pointed out some interesting things about the connection between Greek philosophy and Mahayana philosophy.
Uh-huh.
So the focus of my interest for years now has been understanding the full political, philosophical, and sociological context that the Zen movement arose in China.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is an important subject, but I don't know if it's ever going to be important to anybody but me and people in China.
Can you
Partly,
say something specific like that, you know, that you've
yeah, I can. I can
gleaned
say
out of this?
I can tell you many things specific. One of them is that people kind of take Zen teachings as a given. I mean, in the way that it's presented to them, but historically, what we deal with now in Zen Buddhism, especially Japanese Zen Buddhism, has only a remote relationship with how it developed, how the philosophy developed and succeeded in China, and we almost completely ignore what I think are the most important political aspects of what Zen was about.
Which are?
Well, Zen was, in my view, a reaction against. I mean, first of all, let me preface this by saying Bodhidharma wasn't the first practitioner of Zen in China by a long shot. People had been practicing meditation and talking about the nature of the mind for hundreds of years before, at least couple hundred years before Bodhidharma was active.
Yeah.
So why did the Chinese pick him as the first ancestor or the first patriarch?
Well, isn't it because there's his lineage survived?
I don't think that's the reason, because he was regarded as the. I mean, of course, in a sense, that's true, because if anybody's lineage had died out, they wouldn't be regarded as the first patriarch. But that doesn't really explain why he got particular attention in that respect. So
good story. Maybe because it's a good story.
Well, I think that a lot of it was based on politics, not surprisingly.
Like what?
Well, Zen prided itself on being and Bodhidharma in particular was one. There were several teachers came from India around that time.
Yeah.
And one of them was already the teacher of the Northern Wei Dynasty emperor, and he was the guy that actually built Shaolin Temple. It had nothing to do with Bodhidharma.
Yeah.
And he was teaching the nature of the mind and so on. But Bodhidharma's unique feature was that he was one of the only teachers that came from India that would not hang out with the emperors, that didn't like them. And in fact, his defining story is his unwillingness to hang out with Emperor Wu, right?
Yeah.
And that's the defining story. That's a defining story. There were other people there at the time and after him who always sought the emperor's support, because they thought, like the Catholic Church thought when it made Buddha into a saint, that all they have to do was convert the guy at the top and everybody else would follow.
I think they unsainted Buddha, didn't they?
Yeah, they unsainted him. But my point is that the politics always plays a big part in all religions.
Yeah.
And it was no exception in Zen. But Zen's politics were especially to reject imperial Buddhism.
Yeah.
And that's well known. I mean, that's tacitly acknowledged in the Zen tradition all the time. When they talk about the northern school being the school of Shen Wei and the emperor, and the national teacher of the emperor and so on, and as opposed to the southern school of Hui Neng, who defied the emperor's edict that everyone had to get ordination on the imperial platform, and he set up his own platform. In fact, he created something called the Platform Sutra, which was a direct act of political defiance to the emperor. So, I mean, that's some of the background story, and I talk all about this in my book, Tracking Bodhidharma. The last half of that book follows this political line and explains it in a lot more detail than I'm giving you here. But I went beyond that book and went into the depth of the source of Mahayana, and I found that there are all kinds of indications outside of normal scholarship. I mean, I've read a lot of Western scholars now, and I don't think any of them really tumble to this. But the Asian scholars I've read, who I really think know what they're talking about, deal at length with the political milieu that gave rise to Mahayana Buddhism. And it was characterized by the cult of Maitreya, for example, which was a millenarian cult that believed that was taken over by emperors who were trying to make everyone be convinced that they were Maitreya. So I mean, they would literally go into the caves in Dunhuang and carve carve their likenesses on the faces of the Buddha so that people would worship them. The monks in the caves would worship them, and declare themselves to be Maitreya, and so on. So the political machinations around all of the development of Mahayana Buddhism are enormous, just tremendous, enormous. And the doctrinal developments that came out of that are also not that much different than the kind of doctrinal fights that happen in Christianity. So to me, that the reason why this matters, why any of this matters, I mean, really, who cares? Except for one thing, to me.
Yeah.
And that is that within the context of the Zen Buddhist tradition in China was one of the only ways, if not the best way, to live a life of some sort of psychological and political freedom from the emperor in ancient China. Because Zen just completely eschewed metaphysics and refused to engage in the metaphysical. I mean, early Zen refused to engage, for example, with the Bodhisattva ideal. Baizhang, everyone thinks they know what Baizhang was about. Nobody knows anything about Baizhang. Baizhang's entire record was completely destroyed. Not all of the record, but his main writings and the clear rules were completely destroyed at the end of the Tang Dynasty, and nobody had them anymore. They were gone. And the rules of Baizhang that we have today were written 3 centuries later, because Baizhang was anti-imperial and anti-bodhisattva. He told people, don't follow the bodhisattva path because it's the path of imperial Buddhism. And 3 centuries later, the emperor tried. He still had such a great reputation. 3 centuries later, the emperor rewrote the pure rules. And what's the first one of the pure rules? I'm sure nobody knows offhand. But it's to honor the emperor's birthday. What do we do when the emperor has a birthday? How do we honor it? The whole thing was to reestablish political control and to consolidate political control over the Zen movement. I mean, people talk about Baizhang and the Qinggui, the pure rules. They don't know what they're talking about. They were completely destroyed and gone. The only record we have to even know what I'm talking about is the fact that in the lamp records, there's a record of Baizhang, which still exists, that actually came from Baizhang, and it explains how he was and what he believed. And among the things he said was, "Don't follow the Bodhisattva path." So the whole political question around Zen is way more complicated than anybody comprehends among the current world of practitioners, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And nobody really engages around that, because now there's two parts of this. One is the part I'm talking about, which is the political, social, economic, philosophical, which I haven't gone into yet, part of Zen. And then there's just the personal practice of just sitting down, counting your breath, staying upright, dealing with the world from a balanced position, which is great, which people do, and it's all they need to do in terms of that practice. But it just isn't the historical picture is something completely different than what the wisdom we've received, in my view. And it's far more complicated than I've talked. I've given you a few of the highlights here, but the actual story is, to me, really fascinating, and it hasn't been written yet. I mean, the real contradiction between early Zen of Bodhidharma and the political world was the fact that the great Tang Emperor Tang Taifu, I haven't found a lot of documented evidence about this, but I've seen indications that he struggled mightily to bring Zen under control, and the way he did it was to co-opt it. And so he went around and started honoring Bodhidharma and the second Ancestor and others, setting up monuments or at least edicts recognizing them. And the reason he tried so hard to control Zen was because it was the only sect that wouldn't kowtow to him. All the other, he forced the heads of all the other sects of Zen to move to the capital city so he could keep them under control. But the fourth ancestor, who was alive at that time, said, well, fuck you, you can cut my head off. I'm not coming. And so the political fight was set at that point. And Zen in some sense benefited from that, because of the emperors, in order to co-opt Zen, would glorify Zen, say how great it was, because everybody was following it. So they wanted to, become the greatest patron of this thing that everybody loved. But the fact is that there was a political struggle all the time, and the sixth ancestor was the main actor in that, because he was the one that rejected the Northern School, rejected imperial Buddhism very clearly. But it was rejected by the others too, especially by John and the fourth ancestor. Which, that's why the Zen monks became farmers. They were the ones that were not standing around waiting for a handout from the emperor so they could build temples with it. They just went off and lived on their own. So you have to see all of this within the political context, in my opinion, to understand it. Now, let me circle back again to what I was starting to explain. Why is any of this important? And it's because there's this unique personal freedom that existed in the Zen tradition in China that was really an expression of political freedom. And I think that today there are people in China that understand this, because they read my book and they understood what I was getting at, and they've contacted me about it. But
you're talking about the Bodhidharma.
Tracking Bodhidharma. Yeah.
Tracking Bodhidharma.
Yeah, but the whole story needs to be told to a much greater degree, because Zen in China, Zen really was the path of ethical behavior. I mean, it was really the very, very sophisticated philosophical, aesthetic, and ethical path. The highest path in China. So you have to, I think that needs to be acknowledged and recognized to a greater extent than it has been. Especially among Chinese.
Wow.
So yeah, that's where I've been for the last several years. I've written a novel about it. Maybe I'll publish that at some point.
Oh, do. I mean, you've got to have an update on tracking Bodhidharma. It sounds like, huh?
Yeah, it isn't really an update on tracking Bodhidharma. It's really a historical novel around Emperor Wu.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
But I don't know. It's pretty much written, but I've got to force myself to finish it, tie it up. Anyway, that's pretty much where I'm at, and
that is great. That is really interesting. I am really happy to hear you're still charging ahead, and really interesting scholarship. I mean, that is getting at critical information. You know what I mean? A lot of scholarship is seems to me to be sort of just less significant.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I've found is that when I've read Mahayana scholarship about the origins of Mahayana and so on, it's so speculative, and almost nobody brings in the political angle. And it's just really a bunch of speculation about where it arose and whether or not the Gandharan Buddhas were part of a real Greek movement, or whether it was just Greek influence from Alexander the Great that spread to the Kushan Empire, but we don't really know what's going on. And then they do philological analysis, and a whole lot of it doesn't make much sense to me because it just seems kind of disjointed and unbased in anything. But when you start examining the, various political aspects of it, like the fact that the Greek kings that ruled in northwest India, they were apparently influenced very much by Buddhism and developed it as a political ideology themselves, because the coins they minted have them displaying themselves, showing mudras with their hands. These were Greek. These were Greek kings. So the connection between East and West is another really interesting aspect of this, and especially in terms of philosophy. Neoplatonism. I'm of the opinion that Neoplatonism and the consciousness-only school of Xuanzang, who went off to India, or have important historical connections. But that's all stuff that's still kind of speculative. You have to kind of go on the evidence of how the philosophies were similar rather than understanding exactly how it happened.
Yeah.
So that's more speculative. But I personally think that there's a strong tie in there.
Wow.
I mean, some of the stuff that I translated in my book on translations in Zen's Chinese Heritage, you find it in Greek folklore and Greek sayings and so on. It went right through the sutras. The sutras contained some of those phrases that were Greek in origin, and then it fell out into the Zen lamp records too.
Overall, how significant do you think Greek influence was on the development of Buddhism? Go on.
Now, this is speculative.
You're right. I was going to say that. I know you're.
But the primary evidence is just the fact that Mahayana Buddhism developed in a cultural milieu that had been heavily influenced by the Greek colonization of Northeast India. In particular, one of the obvious examples is questions of King Belinda, right? The fact that there's this Greek king in the Buddhist scriptures. There was a Greek king who was queried by a Greek monk, a Greek Buddhist monk named Nagasena, and to me that sutra reads like a Greek political argument, because in most of your Asian despotisms, the king was never questioned. Whereas in this one, where in that sutra it says there were 500 Greeks in the audience, the Greeks were very contentious. They were arguing and asking, wait, what is that true? What are you talking about? And you have this situation where it's kind of like Alexander the Great. He would engage his men and argue with them, whereas an Asian king wouldn't do that. An Asian king would simply be that their word goes, and that's that.
Yeah.
So the questions of King Belinda are the obvious examples where a Greek king was supposedly heavily influenced by the development of Buddhism, and that was coextensive. The time and place was coextensive with the development of Mahayana ideas, at least Mahangatika. But really, it took off, I think, in the Kushan Empire, which was a Greek-influenced Asian empire. You know, so Kanishka the Great. Kanishka the Great was the first big emperor of the Kushan Empire, and he totally adopted Buddhism as a political ideology. And a lot of the sutras came out of that time period, especially from the city of Taxila in India. So I think there's very interesting circumstantial evidence about how this developed politically. But you know, the key characters in the whole thing, like Nagarjuna, Ananda, and Vasubandhu, are really, nobody really knows about them. I mean, I've read different books about them that are seem very speculative to me. Like, nobody really is sure. They're kind of, people are coming up with these half-baked theories about what they were doing, what they were about. But I think that when you talk about some of them, especially Nagarjuna, in terms of politics and his attempt to make Mahayana Buddhism the most accepted form of Buddhism to the ruler. And you understand that that's a universal impulse. You know, religionists try to get the ruler to accept them because the ruler has the money. If they want to build a monastery, that's where they get the money.
Yeah.
So I think all of it needs to be examined within that kind of political context to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I want to go back in time. Where do you come from? Where were you born?
In Oregon.
Oh, right. You and Jeffrey came from the same place. Is that right? Jeffrey Hayden?
Yeah, we grew up together. I don't know if you heard it. Jeff died 3 years ago.
I had not. I wondered. Oh, well. You know, I used to see him when I went to Bandon. I mean, I kept visiting him in Hopland, and then Katrinka's son was moved to Bandon, and I'd go see Jeffrey and his mother. I'm not surprised he wasn't in great shape.
Yeah.
What a character. Good Lord. I talked to him just a few years ago. Maybe 5 years ago, last time. You know, a phone call.
Yeah, that makes sense. He died in January of 3 years ago. Let's see, this is 2022, so that was 2018 or 19.
Yeah. We could do January. A whole podcast just talking about Jeffrey. So I'm going to move on. But, I mean, don't you think? I mean, really amazing guy. Wow. All right. Hey, all right. So you came from Oregon. What's your path? I mean, how do you trace your path from there to getting into Buddhism? And getting into Chinese, not just Buddhism, but getting into Chinese studies and Asian studies.
I don't have anything special about how I fell into it. I was as gullible and as naive as everybody in the 60s. And
when were you born? What year were you born?
51. And
you were born in 51, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, when I read Marshall McLuhan, like everybody was doing in 1967 or whenever it was, he made this statement that Chinese is a ideographic language that has little pictures, and it doesn't have an alphabet. And because of that, Chinese people don't think linearly like we do in the West. They think three-dimensionally because they think in terms of, I don't know why a picture would necessarily be three-dimensional, but that was his line. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. And so I decided I'd study Chinese and see if that were true. Within a few weeks, I realized that he didn't know what the hell he was talking about.
That's right. And that's been discredited. You know that Ezra Pound was into that, and Fenolosa, and...
right. Yeah, I mean, Ezra Pound in particular was particularly egregious. in how he approached Chinese, and the idea that he knew Chinese is just so absurd.
Yeah.
I had an interesting discussion about that with W.H. Merwin.
Huh.
I used to visit W.H. Merwin at his house in Hawaii, and Merwin was an early devotee of Pound. Went to visit Pound when he was in the insane asylum at Bedlam. And,
goodness.
Anyway, I talked to Merwin about that to some degree, but I didn't press the point about Pound because it's kind of rude. But the fact is that Merwin was really interested in those, Pound and Joyce and all the writers that were circulating around Pound in the early 20th century. But anyway, my point is that I got caught up in kind of the romance of the whole thing. But then when I took Chinese, I realized that, well, all that crap that Marshall McLuhan was saying is a load. But on the other hand, it is a really interesting language and very expressive. And so I hung with it, being pig-headed. I was not learning. I didn't seem to be making any progress until I had studied it for about 15 years. I could speak it and so on, but in terms of really getting into the classical stuff and understanding how to read classical Chinese and stuff, it took a long time to develop those skills.
Where did you study? Where did you begin your studies of Chinese?
I studied at the University of Oregon, and then I went to the University of Hawaii for a while, and then went back to Oregon. And then I started working in the industrial world, and I lived in Singapore, and I lived in Taiwan, and I lived in Singapore.
You were in Singapore a long time. How long was that?
About 5 years.
Uh-huh. Wow. I'd love to go to Singapore, but 5 years, that'd be a long time.
Yeah, it was especially a long time when we lived there because you didn't have the internet and all the stuff they have these days. I mean, basically then you had one TV channel that you could watch in the evening. It came on at 5 o'clock and turned off at 9. And it showed you, and we got to watch either Dallas and Cheers, and that's about it.
What years did you live there?
I lived in Singapore from 81 to 86.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Have you been back?
I haven't been back in a long time. I went back around the year 2000. And it had changed mightily from 86 till 2000. I went back a few times in the 90s. And the last time I went back was around the year 2000.
Yeah, I was there.
It had already transformed itself.
Right.
A lot.
Right.
Yeah.
I was there first time in 92 and then 2003. And then when we came here in 2013, and it just keeps changing. I really admire them. I think they're doing a great job. Just that one little place, and it's really fun to visit. And their botanical garden, was it there when you were? I bet it was there long ago, huh?
Oh yeah, I used to jog in the botanical garden every day.
Yeah, I love it. And they got all this new stuff now. Anyway, what were you doing there?
I was working for an American industrial company as an engineer. And then I first as an engineer, then I switched companies to another competitor and worked as a regional sales manager.
And did you continue your Chinese studies? I mean, there's...
Oh, yeah. The whole time I lived in Asia, we lived there for 5 years. And then we lived in Hong Kong for 4.5 years.
Oh, goodness. And you said you were in Taiwan, too?
I lived in Taiwan for a year after I got out of college.
Oh,
This was much later. This was much
Uh-huh.
later. So yeah, I mean, and when I lived in Hong Kong, I traveled inside mainland China most of the time. Um,
Oh.
right up until my wife and I were in Beijing in May of 1989 in the prelude to the massacre,
Uh-huh.
and watched the hunger strikes and the tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people marching in demonstrations and all that. And we managed to get out of town and go back to Hong Kong where we were living before the event happened.
Uh-huh.
I mean, before the massacre happened. But we saw all of that. We saw the buses barricaded around the downtown area and helicopters
Hmm.
flying over me when I was walking down the street with the machine guns hanging out and, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Wow. When did you? I mean, one thing that you've done that's very impressive is your tours of China. When did that start?
Um, the first main organized tour I took was San Francisco Zen Center in the year, I think it was the year 2000 or 2001.
Oh, is that right? That's when it started.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, of course, I was traveling in China extensively before that, but in terms of leading an organized tour, that was the first.
And you did a number of them, and they got to be a pretty big deal.
Yeah, we did quite a few. We did one or two a year for, sometimes three a year for a few years. And
And what was the
and they,
business called? I used to post all sorts of stuff about that. It's still on cuke.com. What was the business called? I forget now.
South
China
Mountain China
Tours.
Tours.
What
South
it's it?
Mountain.
South Mountain China Tours.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And
And a lot of work went into preparing those tours because my business partner Eric, a wonderful guy, and I set out to find all these ancient Zen sites in China, and we did. I mean, we found 30 or 40 of the major temples, the most well-known teachers, whether it was Huineng or Madhu or all the ancestors, starting from Bodhidharma down through Baizhang, then
wasn't Bill
many
Porter
others.
involved with you in some of that?
Bill and I traveled together several times in China.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes we would swap off and lead tours together.
And one thing that I've attributed to you and Bill is that Bodhidharma used to be called, and in Crooked Cucumber, I said the semi-legendary Bodhidharma. And I did an audiobook of Crooked Cucumber that came out Shambhala last November, and I created a second edition of the book that's on cuke.com, and the audiobook's really second edition. And that one of the changes there was I took out semi-legendary because I think you all have shown that he was a real person.
Yeah, there was a tendency in Western scholarship after World War II to call into question the actual historical existence of a lot of figures, and Bodhidharma was one of those figures. There's just too much circumstantial evidence that he did exist to imagine that he didn't, in my opinion.
Yeah. And do you remember looking for proof of the second ancestor? I can tell you.
The second ancestor, Hui Ke, is really one of the most fascinating things to me because one of the major tours that I took to China was Vermont Zen Center, and we arranged for Vermont Zen Center to go to the ancestral place of the second ancestor in northern China. And it's actually at a place called the Second Ancestor's Village.
Right. And my understand what I remember talking to you and Bill about this is that you all discovered it. And it was called Second Ancestor Village at the time that scholars didn't believe it necessarily existed, or isn't that true? And I remember you saying that somebody there took you to what had been his temple, which was, I don't know, I have this image of a totally destroyed, temple, practically
Right, yeah,
a pile of rocks.
That's accurate. It was completely destroyed in the Cultural Revolution.
Oh.
But interestingly, the villagers were completely devoted to his memory.
Oh.
I mean, just totally devoted to his memory. And when I took the Vermont Zen Center there, they got word in advance we were coming, of course, because Eric let them know and told them we were coming and blah, blah, blah. And when we showed up, they literally turned out, the entire village and people from miles around turned out to welcome us with open arms and brass band, essentially. It was just a celebration. Everyone was so completely shocked when from Vermont Zen Center. I think it's fair to say that everyone was delightfully surprised by the whole thing, and it was quite an event. But and what exists there, of course, is the marker of, there were 3 monuments created by Emperor Wu to memorialize Bodhidharma, and one was there, one's at Shaolin Temple, and one's at Kungshan Temple, which is Bodhidharma's burial place, purported burial place.
Mm-hmm.
And it's there. It was in the ground, and they had dug a hole out around it because it had flooded and it had been covered with mud, and so they dug it out again so we could see it. And now I think it's completely. Over the years, as we went back there with other tours, they restored it and restored other things and tried to. They've actually built a hall there now. But the political story around that village is complicated, and I don't really know the details of it, so I shouldn't comment on it. But it's complicated.
Yeah, I remember you telling me about, as your tours developed, that you would bring a group there, and there'd be a banquet for you, and you were very well received. At the same time, people were telling me, Buddhism is repressed in China and this and that. I said, well, that's not what I'm hearing. I think it depends on, correct me, or elaborate on this, in how well it harmonizes with the political situation in China.
Yeah, that's always true. And then what else? The other point to remember is that, or the other couple of the points about it is that the situation locally in China from one place to the next can vary hugely if you go 10 miles down the road. You can be under a different local administration that's friendlier, maybe officials that actually love Buddhism or love Zen or so on, and the way that they treat their local temples is with great respect and help and so on. You might go 20 miles down the road, and you've got somebody that wants to develop that land into a hotel.
Yeah.
So you never know. You never know what the situation is. It's not simple.
Yeah, I remember you making the point in the past that one thing that had encouraged the fixing up temples and being positive about it was that it brought tourism, it brought money in, right?
Yeah, there's certain local officials that look at it that way. They look at it as part of the tourism golden goose.
Yeah.
Of course, Shaolin has always served that purpose. For a long time now it has. It hasn't always been that way, but it's, everyone, all the martial arts people in the world that practice Chinese-related martial arts want to go to Shaolin Temple, and so for a while there at least, I don't know what the situation is now, but for a while there, the admission ticket was pretty high, and most of it went to the government somehow.
Now, Bodhidharma was not his era at Shaolin was before all the martial arts stuff. Is that right? Or what?
Yeah. The martial arts stuff at Shaolin wasn't connected with Bodhidharma historically. I mean, there's no evidence of that. There is evidence that starting about the time of the third. Now, the Shaolin Temple was built about the time that Bodhidharma was living there. I personally think that from the historical record that it indicates that Bodhidharma left because they built the temple. He might have been living there, and then when the emperor Zen master, there was another Zen master that taught the Northern Way emperor, and he said I want to build this temple up there. The Northern Way emperor was a member of a barbarian group that had taken over northern China. Well, he had 3 different rebellions against him from Buddhist monks, and so he was always keen on making sure there were no freelance Buddhist elements around. He wanted to control the scene. Well, Bodhidharma was a freelance element, and when they built Shaolin Temple, it might have been, this is somewhat speculative, but it might have been because he had a good following and he was living around up there, and they said, well, we're going to build our temple up there and take over control of that place. And when news came around that was going to happen, Bodhidharma and his followers left. The historical record indicates that he left at that point and went to southern China. Or at least he left and went somewhere. And most evidence points toward him going to southern China.
Yeah. And so, all right, I get this picture. You're in college, and you start studying Chinese, and you're young there, and you go to and live in Asia for 10 years or something. And but where did the Buddhism creep in there?
I think, ironically, well, 2 ways. First of all, I mean, it was actually the sutra, the questions for King Milinda that piqued Milanda. Is it Melinda? Milanda. That piqued my interest originally. That's the I was a teenager and I read that sutra, and it was one of the things that piqued my interest. Another thing was that I took a course in modern art and literature and modern graphic arts, and like everybody in the 60s, we were studying John Cage, and John Cage was talking about Zen, and one of his koans stuck with me. He told a koan, and to this day, I still think it's one of the great koans, and that is the one about Huang Bo coming to the riverside. Huang Bo meets another monk, and they're traveling together, and they hit it off and become great friends, and they come to the edge of the river, and the other monk, who is so spiritually advanced, he says, "Come on, follow me," and he starts walking out across the water. And according to John Cage, Huang Bo then said, "No, wait, let me show you where the rocks are." And that's really
wait. Let me show you where the rocks are. The other monk says that, or
Huang Bo says that. Huang Bo says that to the other monk. The other monk starts walking out across on top of the water,
right,
across the river. His advanced spiritual state and all that.
Right.
And Huang Bo yells out, "No, wait, let me show you where the rocks are."
What does that mean? I don't understand.
Let me show you where the rocks are to walk across the river, instead of walking on top of the water.
In other words, you don't have to walk on the water. You could be walking on rocks.
right. You don't have to be an advanced spiritual being. You can be an ordinary mind, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So so that piqued my interest, and then I've always felt that there are different versions of that mythical story,
Yeah, yeah.
and
That's the
and
first time I've
there's a
heard
lot of
that
other there's
version.
a lot of other there are other versions that I think are good too, and so
Yeah.
it stuck with me and it piqued my interest.
Ah, ah. And but you got really into it. I mean, your knowledge is far deeper and more thorough than almost anybody. Uh, Maybe uh, as much so as anybody in the Western world. So I mean, it's not you just it's not just you read this sutra and went, oh, that's neat. I mean, when you were in Singapore, when you were in Hong Kong, Taiwan, were you studying? Were you reading stuff in Chinese Buddhist writings? And
I did. I read a lot of those things when I was there, but I wouldn't say I was heavily devoted to it because I was working full time, making a living, raising a family.
yeah,
Um, it wasn't until I'd have to say it was when I was in the class with Reb at Green Gulch, and I realized that my knowledge of Chinese was good enough to read all the stuff in the original rather than reading Thomas Cleary's translations.
yeah,
And don't get me wrong, Thomas Cleary is a great translator. He did a great job. But there were
yeah,
things that I thought were different than necessarily the way he interpreted it, and so
yeah.
that piqued my interest and made me go deeper into it.
Well, there's people that are more negative about his translations than that, but I, you know, I don't pay them much attention. I mean, he was
Well,
amazing.
no translator's perfect.
Right,
Me either. And like everything, it isn't just a question of knowing Chinese. It's a question of knowing the type of Chinese that was written in that era and how they did it with Zen stories and
right,
so on.
right,
And
right,
and and so I tried to train myself by getting scholarly books from China that explained the special terminology that was used in that era and that sort of thing.
right,
Um,
right,
and how the different types of pronouns they used and so on.
right.
So because China wasn't static and the language evolved just like languages evolve everywhere.
Yeah, they evolved pretty quick. I mean, I just know from living in Japan and knowing older people and reading stuff from pre-war to post-war. I mean, just in the last 100 years, there've been all sorts of changes in Japanese. You know, one impression I got from knowing you and Bill Porter was that you all not only read, studied, translated the Buddhist writings from Chinese, but you were dealing with Chinese writings on this, writings and Chinese scholars on this, and there's a lot of translation that happens, and I did it too. I just did it to study when I was living at Tassajara. I started in the 60s. I'd take, like Dogen, and just go character by character. What does this mean? And then I'd talk to Yoshimura Sensei, Kobuchino, Suzuki Roshi, Katagiri about it. And I'd make these little character books on Genjo Koan, Fukan Zengi, Sando Kai, and some stuff like that. But I knew how it was just like beginner stuff. There's people that do books that way. They're translations of the Tao, and they're and
Yeah,
right? Am I right?
I'm aware of that, David. Really, this is going to sound terrible,
Uh huh.
but I've read a lot of books by people who do translations, and a lot of it is just, it's either misguided or they don't understand the fundamental underlying themes of the Zen world in China, of Chan Buddhism. There are certain underlying themes that uphold the Zen tradition that are almost completely ignored in the West. I mean, completely ignored.
Yeah.
And if you look, for example, I mean, the defining, you might say, mission statement of Zen, of Chan Buddhism, is the Buddha's statement on Vulture Peak, this apocryphal story, where he says, "I possess the true Dharma I, the true mind of Nirvana, whose true sign is signlessness." And, the sublime Dharma gate. So right in that defining story of how Zen was created, and it was, of course, an apocryphal story, but it says how Zen wants to define itself. It defines itself in terms of the teaching of the true Dharma I, which is the nature of the mind, and the sublime Dharma gate of signlessness. Well, that's how it defines itself. And if you don't if you're not thoroughly grounded in those ideas when you're reading Zen literature, you just come up with all kinds of silly junk that has nothing to do with the Zen tradition. But it's fanciful, and and so you really have to ground yourself in the literature and look carefully at how it defines itself historically, and work from that, and not work from, people come up with all kinds of silly ideas about Zen Buddhism. They always have, which is one of the reasons why. One of the reasons why I'm not really interested in hanging around with those people. I mean, they just shoot their mouth off about some idea they have. It's an integrated, comprehensible tradition based on certain underlying principles, and to interpret it otherwise. It has some wild personalities in it, but those wild personalities. I mean, Mazu is a wild personality in the tradition, but he never strayed away from the essential teachings that come out of the Lankavatara Sutra, or the teachings on the nature of mind and so on. Those are all integral to what he taught. So, it's an integral, a well-integrated tradition that has its own internal logic, and you have to study it and interpret it that way.
I remember you focusing on the statement, look, is this Bodhidharma, huh? Look directly at mind and become Buddha.
Yeah, point directly at the human mind, see its nature, and become Buddha.
That's Bodhidharma, right?
Yeah, that's attributed to Bodhidharma. And I think my book, Tracking Bodhidharma, by the way, most people haven't read it. And the first half of the book is, frankly, pretty boring. It's just a travelogue. But in the second half of the book, I get into the details about the fact that there's real evidence, especially the memorials from Emperor Wu, that Bodhidharma taught the Mu koan.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and so when you look, those stela, those landmarks that were dedicated to Bodhidharma supposedly by Emperor Wu, or probably by his son, Jiao Ming, specifically refer to that. And also, there's an ancient poem in China, which I talk about in my book, which says that Bodhidharma came from the West with only one thing, Mu. And that poem seems to be really old, and the later references to the Mu koan, especially Jiaozhou, and there was somebody that preceded Jiaozhou, or Joshu in Japanese. Those references were not the first historical references to the Mu koan, and they actually go back to contemporary with Bodhidharma, I believe.
Wow!
So I discuss that in my book.
That's really something. So, Andy, I got I'm working on. I'm doing a little music on the side these days to have a little balance in my life, and I got musicians arriving here pretty soon. I got to prepare for them, but I want to continue this, like, I don't know, in a week, 2 weeks, a month, whenever you want to. Might be better to do it sooner, then you'd have a sense of what you'd said.
That's true.
Yeah. So I'll just call you back.
Okay. All right. Yeah, you just shoot me an email, David, and we'll find a time.
Yeah, well, this is the best time for me. 9 o'clock. I actually prefer 10 o'clock in the morning here, which is 6 p.m. for you. But after the 13th, which is coming up, it's 10 o'clock here. Will be 7 p.m. there. Is that all right with you? 7?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I'm pretty free, so we can sort that out.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that was great. I loved it. Gee, I really appreciate everything you had to say. It's more interesting than most things that are going by these days. All right. I'll talk to you in a week or so. All right?
Okay, good for now, David. Take care of yourself. We'll talk later.
Yeah, thanks a lot. You take care.
Okay, bye-bye now.
All right, bye-bye. So thanks a lot, Andy. Very good. Appreciate it. We'll be getting a hold of you soon. This has been a Cuke Audio Podcast. I'm DC Poobah of Cuke Audio Cuke Archives, coming to you from sleepy Sonora with Doggy Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.